Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Joseph Krolikowski, and I'd like to welcome you all to the ISO 9001-2015, Knowing What to Expect to Ensure a Stress-Free Audit webinar. We're glad you're here, and let's get started. Couple of technical notes for everyone. All of our participants today are on mute, but we absolutely want to address your questions. So please utilize the question portion of the dashboard. We will address your questions at the end of the presentation. One of the more common questions that we get is whether or not the presentation will be made available after we're done. We do make our presentations available in two key ways. Firstly, if you'd like to have a copy of the slides, they will be available for download from our website shortly after we're finished. And if you'd like to rewatch this webinar with the voiceover, all of our webinars are recorded and they are then put up on our YouTube page. And the link for that can also be found on the PJR website. Our topics for today, I've got some kind of lead-in comments on ISO 9001 and how it's an interpretive document and so forth. We're going to go over how we put this presentation together, how the data was mined, so to speak, from an existing pool of clients and past audits. And we're going to then explore our key areas, our key focus areas in terms of audit preparedness, those being management review, internal audit quality objectives, monitoring, measuring resources, and external provider approvals. I've got some commentary on two additional key areas, that being risk and interested parties. We're going to have a little bit of an exploration of the role of leadership and the leadership interview that's done as part of an ISO 9001 audit, a couple concluding remarks, and then your questions. So for this presentation, it's important for us to establish that ISO 9001 is an interpretive document, and it's been an interpretive document from the very first day it was published. Particularly the 2015 revision, there's arguably even more that is subject to interpretation than there had been in prior revisions of ISO 9001. ISO 9001 2015 is the first version of ISO 9001 to have an explanatory appendix with 8 subclauses therein that explain different items within the standard. It's also one of the only ISO published standards to have a separate supplemental document for explanatory purposes. So let's talk about that for just a second. That supplemental document is the technical standard 9002, which, as you can see, was published about a year after ISO 9001 was published. Now, 9002's full title is Quality Management Systems Guidelines for the Application of ISO 9001-2015. Now, this is an officially sanctioned guidance document. And it gives you clause-by-clause ideas on fulfilling the requirements. Now, none of what's in here is subject to audit. In other words, it's not binding in the same way that 9001 is, but it's very helpful. And we're going to be referring to 9002 in a couple of places in today's presentation, just to give you some context on what the expectations are. Now, if we've got anybody on our presentation today that remembers the old 2000 version of ISO 9004, very similar to that in terms of the clause-by-clause approach that is taken. So, because ISO 9001 is an interpretive document, obviously that means that all of the requirements are subject to interpretation. And therefore, none of these requirements has a perfect method for implementation. It's important for each individual organization to determine what their methodology is going to be. And the role of the auditor then is to look at what you've done, to look at what you've implemented, and exercise their judgment as to whether or not what you've done represents a true fulfillment of the requirement. Now, one of the more interesting changes to the 2015 revision of ISO 9001 was the elimination of procedural requirements. If you dial the clock back to versions 1 and 2, the 87 and 94 versions of the standard, at that time there were 16 required procedures. The procedures required for all kinds of things. The third and fourth revisions, 2000 and 2008, that number was trimmed to six key core procedures. Now in the 2015 revision, there are no required procedures, which obviously, if you've got other ideas on how you want to implement your system, you can certainly feel free to do so. However, and this is key, if you choose to have a procedure or a work instruction for any activity, the content of that document, procedure, work instruction, it can be cited in the context of an audit. And that's due in part to how audit criteria is defined in the ISO 9000 document, where it says that audit criteria is going to be a set of policies, procedures, or requirements used as reference against which the objective evidence is compared. So we're asked sometimes, do we have to have procedures? No, you don't. If we have procedures, do we have to abide by them? Yes, you do. And this is why. Now, it's rather incredible that at this point, ISO 9001 has been in print for over 5 years now. We're going to hit the actual 6th anniversary of it this fall. And obviously, ISO 9001 has been around for over 30 years now. So despite how long we've had this standard, we see the same things getting written up year in and year out in the ISO 9001 audits. And in some cases, it's for companies that have been certified a good long time. It's very interesting. So back in 2018, we did a data mining exercise. We pulled about 350 audits over a 12-month period. And we then drilled down to which of these audits had nonconformances. And then we pulled those nonconformances and we ascertained, okay, where were the issues being cited? Where were the core areas? And we kind of tallied everything up. And we came up with a top 5. And these have been presented in the order of frequency. The number one issue was management review meetings, followed closely by internal audits, quality objectives, calibration, or what the standard refers to as monitoring and measuring resources, and then external provider or supplier approvals. Now, 3 of these, management review, internal audit, and calibration, these are all legacy requirements. We have had these precise requirements within ISO 9001 going all the way back to 1987. So these are not new ideas by any measure. Okay. Now, for the next several slides, I want everyone in the audience today to recognize that we cannot advocate specific methodologies for implementing a requirement. PJR is, of course, a certification body, and we cannot consult. And we cannot be held accountable to the extent that this is an official endorsement of approach. What we're going to be sharing with you here is these are common interpretations and common fulfillment methodologies. Now, if you are in the midst of an audit situation and you feel that you've tried to follow our guidance and the auditor is writing a nonconformance and so forth, We have a process for that. We have a dispute process, and I'm going to be covering that a little bit later in the presentation. So again, this is not an official PJR sanctioning of any particular approach. Okay, so let's begin with management review. Now, from ISO 9001, the clause that houses the requirement for management review is section 9.3. And 9.3 is broken down into 3 subclauses. I'm going to be referring to these as parts. So in part 1, it says that you need to have management review at planned intervals. And it talks about ensuring suitability, adequacy, effectiveness, etc. The key item here that I want to point out is planned intervals. What this statement is communicating is you need to have some control in place in terms of frequency and content. Now, what those controls are going to be, that is entirely at your discretion. We've seen companies do very well with schedules, with procedural stipulations, with automated reminders within their calendars, things of this nature. But you have to be able to demonstrate how you are planning these intervals, for the management review process. Shifting over to part 2, we have a list of things that you need to discuss within the management review meeting. Now, I'm not going to read this to you here, but there's a lot here. Actions from prior management review, customer feedback, audit results, external provider performance, lots of data, lots of content. Now, each of these items is mandatory, but it's important for you to recognize that you don't have to discuss each item at each management review. So you can kind of parse these out over a series of management reviews if that's a better fit for you and your organization. A lot of our clients find that it's helpful to have PowerPoint presentations to show that they're covering the content. A lot of our clients like to use a standardized agenda format to make sure that they're not missing anything. Now, bear in mind that neither of those is mandatory. Again, you have to be prepared to demonstrate what is your control. How are you ensuring that the content requirements are being met? The last part of the management review requirement talks about the output of the management review. And there's some key verbiage here: decisions and actions. And I always like to highlight this for new companies that are just getting used to ISO 9001. You need to recognize, you need to bear in mind that this management review meeting is supposed to be productive. This is not simply supposed to be a churn of information. You're supposed to be making some decisions or potentially taking some actions based on the things that you are discussing. And in addition, the last part of the requirement talks about retaining documented information. And that whenever you see that phrase, retain documented information, that's a record requirement. So our auditors need to be able to review the evidence that you've had the management review and that the management review was productive, that you had some decisions that were made, actions taken, conclusions reached, and so forth. Okay, let's shift gears now and get into the second most often cited item, and that's internal audit. Now, internal audit is housed in section 9.2, and 9.2 is broken down into 2 subclauses. Let's take a look at those now. Okay, in part 1 of the requirement, it says that internal audits need to be done at planned intervals. There's some familiar verbiage there. To provide information on whether, key verbiage here, the quality management system conforms to requirements as well as the requirements of the international standard, and if the system has been effectively implemented and maintained. So let's digest that first part. First of all, again, this idea of planned intervals. And again, it is purely at your discretion what that's going to mean. We've had organizations that will use, uh, again, an internal audit schedule, a calendar trigger, a database to schedule audits, or some combination of those things even. All of those approaches are going to be acceptable for showing that internal audits are taking place at planned intervals. And just like the management review meeting, if you are inclined to do the internal audit in small bites, if you've got 10 processes and you want to do 2 of them every month or every other month, as long as you're meeting your schedule, that will not be an issue. Now, in addition, I want to take a minute to talk about this idea of the requirements of the international standard. They want you to audit the international standard. Well, you are expected to ensure that all of the requirements from ISO 9001 are included in the internal audit process. Now, a common mistake that's made here could be that you don't audit the internal audit process itself. This happens sometimes when organizations use a consulting firm to do their internal audit for them. And obviously, this is rooted in the idea that you can't audit your own work. So again, yes, you do have to have an audit of the audit, so to speak. Now, I also want to point out this idea about the quality management system. You're supposed to be auditing your quality management system. And I want to kind of connect a few dots in the standard for everybody here. Bear in mind that ISO 9001 establishes that a quality management system is made up of processes. If we look at section 441 in the second paragraph, it says that you need to determine the processes needed for the quality management system. So therefore, you are expected to structure your internal audits with respect to your processes. Process auditing, process internal auditing, has been the order of the land now for 21 years, going all the way back to the 2000 version of ISO 9001. The intent is that you are auditing your processes, not the clauses of ISO 9001 2015 itself. So this raises questions. Well, can we use a clausal checklist and things like this? You can, but you need to be prepared to demonstrate how you are auditing your processes and how you've got this set up accordingly. Okay, the second part of the requirement for internal audits talks about kind of a flow of activities, planning and maintaining the audit program, figuring out what your audit criteria are going to be, selecting your auditors, making sure that your auditors are going to be objective and impartial, making sure that management is kept informed of the results, responding to the results of the audit, as they say, without undue delay. And then another record requirement, retaining documented information as evidence of the implementation. So let's dig into a few of these key ideas here. And let's start with the idea of competency. And we get this, I still get this question probably once a month at minimum. Do I have to have auditors that have gone through auditor school? And I always redirect folks back to the standard. If you read it very carefully, you'll note that ISO 9001 specifies no minimum requirements for auditor competency. Just like anything else in the quality management system, it is up to you, the organization, to decide for yourself what makes an internal auditor competent. So if that means that they are going to auditor school, fine. If that means that they are going to do a period of self-study, that's also fine. You know your staff better than we do, obviously. And you need to make sure that whatever you're doing, it's not just a training sign off, that you actually have a process for it. And bear in mind, you have to determine what those competency requirements are going to be. So whatever you decide on, remember that you're on the hook for that, so to speak. Once you say it, you have to kind of walk it, so to speak. Now, something that comes up frequently, actually, that we saw in a lot of audit packages that we sampled, is an issue where the organization had their internal audit, there were nonconformances that were written, but they didn't respond to them in any fashion, even to say that the findings were without merit, which is a conclusion of sorts, obviously. You need to treat your internal audit nonconformances with the same amount of attention and seriousness as you would give a nonconformance from PJR or from a customer complaint, and so forth. And remember, the requirement says you have to do both correction and corrective action, and that's important as well. It's not enough usually to just respond to the issue and then wash your hands of it and say we're done. Okay, we've corrected the issue. The intent is corrective action. Now, obviously, also we need to be able to see records of the internal audit process. And again, you have a fair amount of discretion here on what's going to work for you. I mentioned checklists earlier. That is a method. There's all kinds of other ways to record the audit. But whatever you're using, I would caution you, make sure that it's not just a set of nonconformances. Once in a while we'll do an audit and we'll say, can we see the records of the internal audit? And we get handed a couple of nonconformances. And we say, well, where's the rest of it? Where's the evidence that the internal auditor looked at the processes, that they were taking samples? Because the NCRs by themselves, that's part of the picture, but it's not the whole picture. So we want to be able to see that the process was executed, that the process was carried out according to your plan for the process. Now, I mentioned consultants earlier, and I want to make a key point here. I want to stress something. This is very popular for clients of ours to have a consultant do their internal audit for them. That's completely fine, obviously, but you need to bear in mind that the overall responsibility for the internal audit program is yours. It does not belong to your consultant. So scheduling the audit, maintaining the audit record, responding to the nonconformances, all of that is your job, not your consultant's job. You need to be able to speak confidently to the PJR auditor about the internal audit process and how it is controlled. The correct answer is not, you need to talk to my consultant. Your consultant is not our client. That's a key thing that you need to bear in mind. Okay, let's move on to the next focus area, and that is quality objectives. Quality objectives, the requirement is found in section 6.2, and this is also a two-part requirement. Part 1 talks about quality objectives being established, and there's verbiage about relevant functions, levels, and processes. And they say that the quality objectives need to be consistent with the policy. They need to be measurable. They need to take into account the applicable requirements. They need to be relevant to the conformity of products and services and enhancement of customer satisfaction. And they need to be monitored, communicated, and updated. And as you can see, we've actually got quite a few focus points here. So let's dig in. First of all, quality objectives have to be measurable. And the idea is that if we don't have measurability, there's really no reliable way to determine if the item was met or not. Now, I want to mention that typically, what we have for quality objectives are what I refer to as variable. So if you say, I want to achieve 90% on-time delivery, well, that's something that you can measure. We had 89% last month, we had 92% this month, and so forth. That's a variable type objective. Um, Now, those are obviously preferred, I would say, but you can also have attribute type objectives. You can have, for example, we want to achieve NADCAP accreditation by May of 2021. Well, that's something that you either make it or you don't. You either have it or you don't. It's not so much measurable as kind of a yes, no, pass, fail type item. But you have to be able to demonstrate, did you hit your mark or did you not hit your mark? Now, the idea of relevancy to customer satisfaction in products and services, this was actually a new idea when ISO 9001:2015 was published. Prior to this, uh, the way that the standard was worded, it basically said you need to have objectives, and organizations were kind of left to their own devices on how those objectives would be developed or worded. Um, so, having said that, um, we do occasionally get questions where organizations come to us and say, well, can we have objectives for things like profitability? Can we have objectives for things like safety and so forth? Absolutely. You can have those items as part of your portfolio of metrics, of objectives. But you need to make sure that some other objectives are going to meet the requirement related to customer satisfaction and product and service conformity. So bear that in mind. Um, Quality objectives are an item that everybody in the company needs to be aware of. They need to be able to demonstrate knowledge and awareness. And there's a lot of ways to accomplish that. I suspect that we've got some folks on our group today. Some of you come from probably large companies, hundreds of folks. So this raises challenges in terms of how you're going to get the word out on the objectives. All kinds of ways. We see placards. Companies will have dedicated meetings on these items. Companies will have cards that get handed out. Whatever works for you, honestly, is what you should pursue. Uh, Lots of possibilities in meeting this requirement. Part 2 of the requirement from ISO 9001, kind of a brief statement. It basically says that when you're planning on how to achieve the objectives, you're going to determine what will be done, the resources required, who's responsible, when it will be completed, and how results will be evaluated. Now, the ISO 9002 talks a little bit about this idea of what will be done. And it says that you need to determine the actions that are going to be implemented to achieve the objectives. It's very much intended to be an active process, not anything that's passive. This is supposed to be something that is done with a fair amount of active involvement. Not something that you simply implement and then just kind of hope for the best. This is something that's part of an ongoing process. And again, it looks like I already made my point on this. Essentially, you have to track progress towards the objectives. And in addition, third bullet on this slide here, this is key. If you don't achieve your objectives, you need to take necessary action. Now, that might mean a full corrective action, but it might not mean a full corrective action. But the idea here, the intent here, is not that you measure the objectives and say, oh, well, if you don't hit your mark. That is not the intent. The intent is that this is an ongoing process and you will respond to underperforming objectives in an appropriate fashion. Let's move on then to monitoring and measuring resources. Now, for most of the folks on the call today, I suspect you understand this requirement as being called calibration. And that is still the most common term that's associated with this. Well, this requirement obviously refers to any device, a tool, a gauge, a meter, a scale, what have you, for performing monitoring and measurement. And most folks refer to this still as inspection or testing. Now, the primary clause at play here is 7.1.5, and there's actually, again, two subclauses that we want to take a look at. Okay, so to begin with, we have this first part where it says that you need to determine what resources are going to be needed for valid and reliable results. You need to pick out the test equipment that you need. You know your product best, you know your customer expectations best and those of the industry. So you need to make sure that you are selecting the right kind of measurement resources. And you need to make sure that you are providing those items that are suitable and maintaining them in terms of their continuing fitness for use. And it says also that you need to retain appropriate documented information as evidence of fitness for purpose for the monitoring and measuring resources. So let's dig into that first part. Um, the last paragraph is the one that gets emphasized the most during the audit process. This business about retaining documented information. Again, that's a record requirement. Anytime we see retained documented information, that's a record requirement. In this case, obviously, it's going to be all those calibration and verification records for your measurement devices. Now, as far as what the content of those records needs to be, for that, we turn our attention to the second part of the requirement. So let's jump into that right now. Okay, so here's how the second part is worded. It says that the measuring devices need to be calibrated or verified at specified intervals or prior to use against measurement standards that are traceable to international or national measurement standards. It goes on to say that if there is no such standard, the basis that's used for that calibration or verification needs to be on the record. It says the measuring devices need to be identified in order to determine status and then safeguarded from adjustments, damage, deterioration, etc., that would invalidate the calibration status. And that you need to determine if there's been an impact on validity of prior measurement results if you find out later that measuring equipment is unfit for purpose, and then take action as necessary. Now, the two most often violated parts of what we just looked at are traceability and identification. First of all, this idea of traceability to national or international standards. Now, here in the United States, in most cases, that's going to be the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the NIST. That means that when we are looking at the measurement device records, we're looking for a NIST code. We are looking for some evidence that there's a link back to the NIST in this calibration that was done, calibration / verification. Now, once in a great while, we have a measurement group, a class of measurement, where the NIST has not developed a method. This is obviously going to be most often associated with very specialized forms of measurement. Where that is the case, you need to figure out what you're going to do. Now, most of the time, it's going to mean going back to the original device manufacturer. But again, that needs to be established and on the record. Also, the idea that devices need to be identified in order to determine status. Now, I want you to pay very close attention to how that's worded. Identified in order to determine status. It doesn't say that status has to be right on the device itself. Once in a while, I'll get a young new auditor who thinks that this means calibration stickers. It doesn't. It means that you have to have a form of device identification that permits traceability to the calibration record. Something that enables us to determine status. That doesn't necessarily mean a calibration sticker. Okay, the last class of items where we saw a cluster of issues was external provider approvals. Now, if you go back to the older versions of ISO 9001, we had different terms that we used for these folks. This included suppliers, subcontractors, outside partners, lots of different ways that we were referring to these types of folks. And in some cases, in those older versions of the standard, the requirements were kind of spread out. So in the 2015 version of ISO 9001, all of those terms were merged. They were merged together under the collective banner external provider. And the requirements were put together under 841. Now, these requirements are not new, but this kind of represents a first time that they've been brought together in one space. And that is, again, 8.4.1. Now, 8.4.1 starts out by saying that you need to determine and apply criteria for the evaluation, selection, monitoring, and reevaluation of external providers. And it also says that you need to retain documented information of these activities. Please note that that says plural, activities, and any necessary actions arising from the evaluations. Okay, so you are required to come up with a methodology for external provider approval. Now, just like the other requirements that we've been looking at today, what that methodology is entirely up to you, whether it be trial run purchase or requiring that they be certified or whatever the case may be, entirely at your discretion. And you can even vary it a bit depending on who it is. You know, if you're talking about raw materials, you may have one set of criteria. That you would have an entirely different set of criteria than for a transport company and so forth. You'll note that the requirement calls for monitoring and for reevaluation. So the idea is not that you approve them once and it's over. The idea is that this is an ongoing process. And again, a record requirement. You have to have records of these evaluation activities. So I want to be very clear on what that means. It means that having an external provider's name on a list is not evidence of evaluation. It does not constitute a record of the evaluation activity. You have to be prepared to show evidence of the evaluation activities, plural, that you went through to approve the external provider. Okay, so moving on from common nonconformances, any discussion of ISO 9001 2015 I feel like is benefited from including a little bit of review on the two new items. They're not so new now, of course, the standard is going on 6 years old, but those two items are risk and interested parties. Anyone that's new to ISO 9001, I always feel like this is a helpful topic for us to spend a few minutes on. So let's start with risk. If you look at the auditable portion of ISO 9001, risk is actually used 16 times through the auditable portion. And risk is viewed as a system-wide item, very much like continual improvement was when the 2000 version of the standard came out. And one of the things that is emphasized, and this is actually mentioned in the Appendix A, the Annex A that we talked about. You are not required to have a formal risk management process, not at all. The idea is that risk aversion, this is something that's going to impact all of the various areas of your quality management system. Now, 9002 gives us a little bit of insight into key risks. And the idea there is your key risks are going to be the failure of your processes, your products, or your services to meet the requirements of the organization. And also the organization not achieving customer satisfaction. So, thinking in terms of where should our focus be as far as risk avoidance. Now, the actual requirement for risk, the primary requirement, if you will, is in section 6.1. And in 6.1.1, it talks about when you're planning for the system, you need to consider the issues that are referred to in section 4.1. This is taken to mean both internal and external issues, as well as the requirements referred to in 4.2. And this means, of course, those from internal and external interested parties. And then determine the risks and opportunities that need to be addressed. I always like to point out the fact that they talk about both risks and opportunities. And it is a two-face coin situation, because a risk, obviously, that's something bad, and we want to reduce that. And you can see in subclause C, they talk about preventing or reducing undesired effects. An opportunity, on the other hand, that's a good thing. That's a desirable effect. So that's addressed in subclause B, that we want to enhance the desired effects. We also obviously want to give assurance that the system can achieve its intended results and that we're achieving improvement overall. So lots of big picture items going on with this identification of risks and opportunities. 6.1.2 then picks up the process and says, well, okay, once you've determined what those risks and opportunities are going to be, you need to then take action to address those risks and opportunities. And you need to figure out how you're going to integrate and implement those actions into your processes. Now, you'll note, again, no emphasis here on having a standalone risk management process. The idea is, okay, you figure out a risk, you figure out an opportunity. How do you then flow that into your existing system, and then evaluate the effectiveness of what you're doing? So lots of key points here. So what do they mean by actions to address risks and opportunities? Well, again, we can look to 9002 for some ideas. 9002 breaks this down into five pieces, five kind of core concepts. Risk avoidance. Is it possible for you to simply stop doing whatever that process is and thereby avoid the risk altogether? Risk limitation. Is it possible for us to establish or modify a procedure or a work instruction to reduce the likelihood of the risk taking place, of the undesired effect happening? Is it possible for us to share the risk? Is there a possibility for us to work with suppliers or customers if it's a financial risk, and kind of spread the load so that we're not the only ones holding the bag, so to speak, if this undesired event happens to happen? Risk transfer, is it the sort of thing where we can purchase insurance or have other similar contingencies in the event that this takes place? And then finally, risk acceptance. If we've taken all of the appropriate preemptive actions, can we as an organization look at what's left and say, okay, we can manage this. This is bearable. Now, in terms of how risk is going to be audited, we've trained our auditors to be very open-minded. We've trained them to ask open-ended questions about this, but by doing that, we've also put an expectation out there that you, our client, you need to be prepared to demonstrate that you understand this concept and explain what you're doing about it. So this cannot be something where you can kind of stumble through it. You need to be, again, prepared to speak with confidence on how you have approached this. And I also like to point out that really there's only one requirement in ISO 9001 that mandates records for risk actions, and that's management review. In 932E, it says that the effectiveness of actions taken for risks or opportunities, those need to be included in the management review process. And obviously 933 says that management review needs to be on the record. Again, a retained documented information statement. Okay, the final item that I want to kind of dig into then that's new is interested parties. Now, the definition for interested parties, we take this from both the 9000 and the 9001 document. This is going to be a person or an organization that can be affected by, or perceive themselves to be affected by a decision or activity. And the common examples that are given are going to be customers, owners, people within the organization, suppliers, bankers, then even folks like unions, partners, or competitors even. Now, if you look at section 4.2 of ISO 9001, it states that the organization has to determine who their interested parties are, but it emphasizes those interested parties that are relevant to the quality management system. Now, the idea is that you're going to have an open mind on who's possible, but that you're going to exercise some discretion as far as who's relevant. And the term even interested party, it's intended to kind of broaden your perspective on who that might be and who might be a contributor. Now, one thing that I want to again emphasize here is not definitely, but most likely it's going to be inappropriate for you to conclude that it is just your customers. Now, we've trained our auditors that if the organization is telling us that it's just the customers that make up the groups of interested parties, we need to dig a little further. We need to ask, okay, well, what process did you employ to arrive at that conclusion? Now, if the organization can show us that a structured analysis was done, well, then fine. We'll accept your conclusion. But if that can't be shown, it's possible that your process to determine relevant interested parties was flawed, and potentially we're looking at a nonconformance. Now, 9002 gives an even more extensive list of who the candidates for external party are going to be. Very long list here: trade associations, unions, competitors, neighboring organizations, all kinds of potentials here. Now, 9002 also gives some good guidance on what the organization should be doing to ascertain the needs of their interested parties. All kinds of things that I bet everyone on our call today, I bet you're all doing these things already. Reviewing the orders that you're receiving, reviewing statutory and regulatory requirements, lobbying, benchmarking, associations that you belong to, surveillance of your market, user surveys, and so forth. Now, is it possible that we can issue a nonconformance related to interested parties? It is actually possible, and there's two special clauses at play here. If we have no evidence or limited evidence that you are monitoring and reviewing interested party information, that would represent a violation of section 4.2. And additionally, if we have no evidence or limited evidence of interested party feedback being discussed within management review, that would represent a violation of section 932C1. Now, as a walk-in additional item, I want to take a few minutes to dig into ISO 9001:2015's requirements as they relate to leadership. And this is found in section 5.1 of ISO 9001. Now, leadership as a concept, when the standard was first published, what we came up with for this was the idea of a leadership interview where our auditor would sit down with the team and go through some of these high-level requirements. In addition to ensuring that leadership was involved in the management of the quality system. So the questions that are asked in the leadership interview, we want to find out, what are you doing to make yourself accountable? How do you participate in the system? Who are the interested parties? How do you monitor interested party requirements? And what are some of the issues that you're dealing with right now? These are high-level ideas. These are ideas that we want to make sure you have an appropriate level of understanding on as members of the management team. Now, understand that our interpretation is that leadership means multiple people in most cases. Sometimes we get a completed audit report and we see a single person in the leadership interview for a company of 100 people. Is leadership really going to be one person when it's 100 people? Probably not. Again, we approach that with suspicion. It's a lot more plausible if it's a very small organization. But every company I've ever audited of any size, leadership is never just one person. It's always going to be a team of folks, and that's who we want to make sure is participating in the leadership interview part of the audit. Now, 9002 even gives us some further guidance on this. It says that authorities and responsibilities can be delegated, but understand that accountability remains with top management. So for those of you that remember the term management representative from the older versions of ISO 9001, yes, you can still have a management representative, but you can't dump the system in their lap. If you are the management team, if you are the leadership team, it is still your responsibility to make sure that the quality management system is implemented and monitored and successful. Now, I mentioned earlier that obviously there are going to be times in an audit where auditor and auditee are going to disagree. Obviously, you take a great deal of pride in your system, and there are going to be times where an auditor and a client have talked something through and they're at an impasse. We always encourage the auditor and client to talk things through as best you are able to do so. But ultimately, if the auditor is convinced they have a nonconformance, they have to write it. But you are not powerless in this situation. You have the right to have a dispute heard by an impartial group to make your case and say, okay, here's why I think this is not a legitimate nonconformance. We have a procedure for that. It's called Pro 10. If you want to get a copy of Pro 10, it's available on our website. If you go to the bottom of the home page, look for registration document download. You can get a copy of the Pro 10 for yourself. Bear in mind, if you're going to file a dispute, you must do so within 15 days, that's calendar days, of the end of the audit. So in conclusion, ISO 9001:2015 remains the world's most utilized standard. There's actually just over 1.3 million registered companies worldwide. And many of the items that are cited in nonconformances, these are avoidable items, and they come up time and time again. It's our hope that the content of today's presentation is going to leave you feeling more confident that things will go well on audit day. Now, if you're ready for a deeper dive, we do have a clause-by-clause course for anybody that is new to ISO 9001 and wants to have a better understanding of what's what in the standard. If you go to our website, if you look for ISO 9001:2015, a clause-by-clause analysis, You can register today. The course is 100% free. Definitely encourage you to check it out. We've had a lot of great feedback on our clause by clause course. I'd like to invite you to tune in for one of our other webinars. We have a presentation on non-applicable clauses, exemptions. This talks about what can and cannot be excluded and why. We have a special presentation, very popular presentation, on the interaction of processes and its importance to a successful audit, how to understand processes, how to develop your processes so that you'll be successful on audit day. And we've got webinars on a whole lot of other topics. We cover stage 1 audits, corrective action, many of the standards that we certify to. We have a lot to offer in terms of webinar content. If you'd like to be kept informed of the latest news automatically, the best way for you to do that is to visit our website at pjr.com. If you go to the bottom of the page, enter your email address in the provided space and click subscribe, you will be opted in for automatic updates on new webinars, changes within the industry, and other points of interest. I do thank you all for your time and attention today. I hope you have found the presentation to be helpful. I'm going to go ahead and unlock the question portion of the dashboard here and see if we have any questions. And we do indeed have some questions. Okay, just to reconfirm, anyone that needs copies of the presentation, those will be available for download shortly after we're finished. And if you want to rewatch the webinar with the voiceover, that'll be hosted on our YouTube page. Okay, Nedra Commodore asks, have you experienced monitoring and measuring requirement effectively applied in a service-only organization? Great question. And yes, absolutely. There are going to be circumstances in a service type company where measurement resources are applicable. Now, whether those measurement resources are subject to calibration, that depends on the device in question. But we definitely do not disregard the requirement entirely just because it is a service organization. Joe Smith asks, we are more of a management company with no measurement tools. Would we need to state that we monitor our sub-vendors for compliance to the calibration requirements of the code? Joe, I would say that that falls more under the monitoring of external providers requirement per se, and it would go to whatever depth of expectation you have on your external providers. But to say that you have to have calibration certificates on hand for your supplier's measurement devices, no, that is not the expectation, excuse me. Brian Lee asks, regarding to risk in the company, some risks may be too confidential, dangerous, or risky for internal auditors to know. In that case, can it be settled as confidential? This is the case. This is in the case of the leadership management audit. Brian, interesting question. We do run into issues of confidentiality from time to time in the context of an audit. I will tell you that if it is relevant to the system, we need to find a way to be privy to that information to the reasonable extent possible. PJR obviously has non-disclosure arrangements in all situations where we have a contract with the client, and we can definitely make provisions even for the audit record to be limited in terms of what's actually captured, names and dates and so forth. But yes, to the extent possible, we would want to be able to review that information. Stephanie Gomez de Souza says, for the purposes of the management interview, should only top management be present, or is it any level management required to attend? Well, Stephanie, to the extent possible, it should be the leadership team. Now, I know some organizations, particularly large organizations, they have top management, middle management, and so forth. We'll leave it at your discretion what is appropriate. But again, the idea should not be that we're just sitting down with the CEO. Let's put it that way. So whomever is going to be the typical assembled team for making the decisions on internal issues, external issues, interested parties, and so forth. That's who should be a participant. Okay, we've got kind of a outside question from Brian Tedley on surveillance audits. Brian, if you've got questions on a virtual audit for your company, I would encourage you to reach out to your scheduler. We can absolutely do virtual surveillance audits, but your question would be better served if you reached out to your individual scheduler. John Kim asks, is a written quality system manual required in ISO 9001? No, it is not. Any quality system documentation is at your discretion. Katie Baird asks, to follow up on the internal auditors, as long as each of our leaders audits each other's processes, is that acceptable? Yes, as long as they are not auditing their own work, Katie, that's completely acceptable, yes. Any other questions today? Katie, you're quite welcome. Glad to help. Any other questions I can answer for folks today? Okay, great. Hope everyone has a wonderful day, and thank you all.